Ah, stepping into the legendary world of the Vikings, there's just so much to tell. I can almost picture you all sitting around the fire, your young eyes wide with wonder. The flames flicker softly, each spark telling a story from thousands of years ago. Here we are, warmed by the fire's glow, and I'm about to take you on a journey through time. The Vikings. Oh, their hunger for the seas, the echo of their war cries on distant shores. But let's go back to the very beginning, to the dark morning at Lindisfarne. It was the year 793. The cold winds from the north battered the English shores, but no one knew that this day would bring a brutal attack from the seafaring warriors of Scandinavia. At the monastery of Lindisfarne, monks prayed as usual, buried deep in their sacred texts. And then, in the misty air of that morning, dark shapes appeared on the horizon. Menacing ships with dragon-headed prows, like ghosts rising from the dark waters, moved swiftly towards the shore. Yes, young ones, the Vikings were coming. The raid on Lindisfarne marked the dawn of the Viking Age. Back then, Vikings were known as ruthless raiders, but this was just the beginning. That morning, the monks' holy books were scattered across the ground. Golden crosses and silver chalices became Viking loot. But here's something important to remember: this wasn't just a raid, it was the beginning of an era. The Vikings had set out to become the masters of the seas, trade routes, and even continents. You, sitting around this fire. If you had lived in those coastal English villages back then, you too would have been powerless against the storm of Viking wings. But it didn't all happen at once. The Vikings weren't just pillagers, they were explorers, traders, and even warrior farmers. Their passion for the deep seas drove them to far-off lands. But that morning in Lindisfarne, they didn't just steal gold and jewels, they unleashed a force that would pull people into the unknown. They created a fear that would echo in legends, poems, and history. That morning, these fierce men who set foot on the shore began to be called Vikings. The word Viking, in Old Norse, means pirate or sea warrior, but it's more than just a name, it describes an entire age. With the raid on Lindisfarne, all of Europe began to fear this new threat. Many people, unsure of how to protect their villages and monasteries, were terrified of Viking attacks. Because the Vikings weren't just coming to fight, they were coming to explore, trade, and even settle. This dawn marked the rise of the fearless seafarers of Scandinavia. Now, I'll tell you about the beginnings of this fascinating age, the first steps, and why all of Europe trembled at the sight of these sea warriors. This is only the beginning. The Viking saga is just getting started. Ah, the Vikings. Who were these brave conquerors of the seas, fearless warriors, pursuers of endless adventures? My young friends, gathered around the fire, I will tell you their epic story. Before we can know the Vikings, we must understand the world they lived in, the land they breathed on, and the seas they sailed. Are you ready? Because I will take you back thousands of years to the cold and windy lands of the north. The Vikings were Scandinavian warriors, sailors and explorers who swept across Europe from the 8th to the 11th century. They were a brave people who sailed from the lands of modern-day Norway, Sweden, and Denmark to distant lands. But being a Viking was not just about plundering and going to war. They were also farmers, traders, skilled craftsmen. They could even be peaceful at times, but it is important to remember this: the Viking Age was characterized by their fierce character and their mastery of the seas. To be a Viking was to have a spirit that could not be lost in the waves. But now I must ask you the real question: how did the Viking Age begin? Let me take you back to the beginning of that period, to the fjord-covered, harsh lands of Scandinavia. Life was hard in these lands, young people. Harsh winters were frequent, and the cold winds bit into people's bones. The soil was barren, food was scarce. But this harsh geography made the Vikings even more resilient and determined. They knew how dangerous the sea was. But rather than frightening them, This awareness made them more attached to the sea. Life promised something beyond the sea. So, towards the end of the 8th century, the Vikings set their sights on lands beyond the sea. The desire to explore new places, the desire to find treasure, and the hope of finding more fertile lands drove them to the stormy seas of northern Europe. The year 793 was the year the Vikings made a strong entrance on the stage of history. With the raid on Lindisfarne Abbey, Europe began to feel the presence of the Vikings in a frightening way. This raid is considered the beginning of the Viking Age, but the Vikings had been exploring and trading long before that. The Lindisfarne raid was in fact only the first time Europe recognized the terror of these fierce seafarers. The Viking Age can indeed be seen as a period of exploration, conquest, and trade. But it wasn't just about plunder, friends. The Vikings were also a people of explorers and traders. Their long ships could withstand the stormy seas of the north and reach even the farthest shores. The Vikings explored not only England but also France, Russia, the Mediterranean, and even the coast of North America. Can you believe it? Back then, people could not even imagine how big the world was. But the Vikings bravely explored this vast world. This is how the story of the Vikings began to take shape. There was life beyond the sea, and they went in search of it. But when something begins, it must come to an end one day, right? The Viking Age was no exception. By the late 11th century, the power of the Vikings began to weaken. Over time, the kingdoms of Europe grew stronger and their castle walls rose. Better defense strategies were developed against the Vikings' attacks. Moreover, Christianity began to spread to the Scandinavian lands, shaking the old pagan beliefs. In this period, the Vikings were no longer just raiders, but a settled people. The year 1066 is considered to mark the end of the Viking Age. On this date, King Harald Hardrada of Norway was defeated by the English at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England. This was the last great campaign of the Vikings. The old Viking spirit lived on in the sagas that echoed across the seas. But the Vikings, their influence never faded. Even today we can find their traces in our cities, in our language, even in our history. The Vikings were not just a people, they were the soul of an age. Their courage, their passion for the seas, and their hunger for the unknown made them an unforgettable part of history. Now, I will tell you the epic stories of the Vikings that will draw you into this long journey. Get ready, because the roar of the seas, the clash of swords, and the excitement of discovery await you in this story. Lindisfarne. That fateful day when the Vikings took their first big step into history. It was the year 793. The cold winds of the north were tossing the waves and the sky was covered with gray clouds. The English monks praying in silence could not have imagined such a horror approaching. Lindisfarne Abbey was a refuge of peace reaching to the sky, but on that very day the shadow of the fearless Vikings fell over this peaceful place. I know how to tell the story because I can almost feel the wind of that day and the roar of the waves on my skin. When the long ships of the Vikings glided across the seas to the shore of the island, it was as if even the sea paused at their arrival, their long ships. They were so majestic that they seemed part of the sea, their shapes reminiscent of the mountains and fjords of the north. Their sails filled with wind and their wooden hulls danced with the waves. But this dance was not a peaceful waltz. No, this was the beginning of a dance that would sweep like a storm, a dance that would be engraved on the stage of history. Reaching Lindisfarne Abbey, the Vikings, armed with swords and axes, charged at the monks with great speed. Screams were heard and fear gripped everyone's heart. Unfortunately, the monks could offer no resistance against these fearless warriors. In that moment, the Vikings appeared not just as marauders or warriors, but as the harbingers of an age that would strike fear around the world. The Lindisfarne raid marked the official beginning of the Viking Age. The year 793 is remembered as the first time Europe felt the terrifying power of the Vikings. But my friends, don't think of this story as just a raid. No, this was actually a demonstration of the Vikings' spirit of exploration. Because the Vikings did not just come to shed blood and collect booty. For them, the seas were not borders but new opportunities, new lands, and new lives. Believe me, behind this oppression was the desire to explore that burned in their chests. To see more places, to find more riches, to explore the unknown. This was the real driving force of the Vikings. The seafaring skills of the Vikings were at a level that no other people had reached at that time. Their long ships were unmatched in both speed and maneuverability. Viking ships were so light and flexible that they could sail not only on the high seas but even on rivers. Imagine. These ships allowed the Vikings to explore both at sea and inland with ease. This unique technology allowed them to reach as far inland as Europe and even as far as North America. In the depths of the oceans, where no one else could reach, the Vikings could. And remember, my young friends, for the Vikings the sea was not just a way of passage. The sea was their way of life. The waves of the sea felt like their heartbeat. Growing up with the rhythm of the waves, this people was born on the water. For them, seafaring was not just a skill, it was an art form. Viking ships, longboats, each a masterpiece, formed the heart of a huge fleet. When they sailed to distant lands, they were ready to explore new worlds, both as warriors and traders. But sailing the seas always carried a risk. Storms, sudden outbreaks of war, starvation, and disease. But despite these risks, the Vikings were always determined to go forward. Their passion for discovery was greater than the obstacles that stood in their way. The Lindisfarne raid was just the beginning, my friends. With their bravery, the Vikings became masters of the seas. But what was more important was the message they sent to the world with this raid: we are here, and we don't intend to leave. This epic beginning of the Viking Age not only brought them fame and fear, but also sparked profound changes in Europe. On the shores of Europe, nothing would ever be the same again. The Vikings were conquering not only lands but also the minds of peoples. Because staying in the minds of a people was a far greater victory than conquering their castles. And that, young men, is how the saga of the Vikings began. The story of a people who sailed across the sea was written not only of conquest, but also of courage, determination, and a passion for discovery. From Lindisfarne, this story will continue to echo across the depths of the seas. Of course, my young friends, the legendary expeditions and raids of the Vikings didn't just stop at a single monastery attack. Oh no. Their warrior spirit soon reached the windy, rocky shores of England and France. The Vikings, emerging from the icy waters of the north, began spreading fear across these lands. But these raids were more than just ordinary attacks. They didn't just rely on their weapons, their intelligence and strategy helped them find a way into the heart of Europe. Let's start with England, especially the eastern coasts of England, which became one of the first targets the Vikings set their eyes on. English villages, rich monasteries, and churches made for prime targets. Yes, my friends, the Vikings weren't just after gold and loot. For them, these attacks were a way to prove their strength. While these raids may have looked like mere pillaging, they were actually a warning. Every place the Vikings set foot on was a place they intended to dominate. Their attacks were carefully chosen, weakening their enemies and sowing chaos. And then, France. Oh, France couldn't escape the Vikings' wrath either. The Vikings, sailing down the Seine River in their long ships, broke the calm of the waters as they made their way to Paris. Paris, one of the largest cities of its time. The river was a pathway for the Vikings, and the city was a treasure trove of riches. As they plundered Paris, they weren't just gaining wealth by conquering such a major city in the heart of Europe. They were proving their strength once again. Each raid emboldened them, and every victory was a signal for more attacks to come. These early attacks on the vulnerable coasts of England and France showed just how clever and complex the Viking war strategies were. They didn't always fight with massive armies. The Vikings mastered the art of small, fast raids that demoralized their enemies. Their strategy was built on sudden and unexpected attacks. They would reach their targets swiftly, cause significant damage in a short time, and retreat just as quickly. This way they caught their enemies off guard and didn't give them a chance to respond. These raids clearly demonstrated that the Vikings were not just brave warriors but also masters of strategy, planning every attack with precision and knowing exactly where and how to strike. The raids were the beginning of a wave of terror that the Vikings unleashed across Europe. But these raids weren't just a method of warfare, they were also a message: we're here, and we're not going anywhere. These quick but impactful assaults caught Europe off guard and made the continent feel the Vikings' power. Now, there was a secret behind the Vikings' ability to carry out these raids. That secret was their longships. Viking longships were one of the greatest inventions in maritime history. Ah, my friends, if you could have seen those ships. These sleek vessels glided gracefully over the water, almost as if they were dancing with the waves. Their long, slender design gave them unmatched speed and maneuverability. They could easily navigate not only the oceans but also rivers. With these ships, the Vikings had no limits. Their longships sped up their explorations, helped them win battles, and made them the most feared power in Europe. Viking longships weren't just filled with warriors, they were filled with hope. These ships gave the Vikings the means to explore faraway lands and unknown worlds. Every ship was a symbol of hope. The sails that fluttered above them propelled the Vikings toward the unknown. Just think about it, no people had ever been so in tune with the sea as the Vikings were. For them, the sea was a road that opened the doors to the unknown. Every time they sailed their longships, they set off on a new adventure. And of course, another reason Viking ships were so effective was their light and portable design. They could navigate the narrowest rivers and even be carried over land. This allowed the Vikings to launch attacks from unexpected places, catching their enemies completely off guard. Ah, these ships were the Vikings' greatest secret, both on sea and land. The power behind the Viking raids and longships taught Europe many lessons. They showed that the Vikings weren't just warriors but also a people who had mastered nature and the sea. They were the true lords of the seas, and every wave carried the echo of their glorious history. These early raids were just the beginning of the Viking saga. What started on the shores of England and France would reverberate throughout Europe for years to come. Because the Vikings weren't just a people, they were a legend that would be remembered throughout history. Ah, my young friends. Now I will take you into the deep traces that the Vikings left on the lands of Britain. This is not just a story of raids and short-lived plundering. This is the story of a long-running conflict that shaped the fate of the Vikings and the fate of England and the Frankish Empire. The green hills of England and the vast lands of the Frankish Empire were the scene of the Vikings' bloody struggle, and these lands were both changed and influenced by them. The Vikings' raids were not limited to pillaging villages. Oh no, they saw these lands as a field of conquest. The strong cities and defenseless villages of the Frankish Empire were shaken by the daring raids of the Vikings. As the empire struggled to cope with these attacks, both politically and militarily, the Vikings came back stronger and stronger each time. These attacks forced the Frankish kings of the time to build tighter defenses. But the Vikings were such masterful warriors that they would suddenly appear with their long ships and disappear in an instant. And of course, England. England was one of the Vikings' biggest targets. The year 865 in particular was a turning point for the land of England. It was in this year that the great Viking army landed in Britain and changed the course of history. Now think about it. This army of thousands of Viking warriors was not an ordinary group of marauders, but an organized and powerful military unit. The kingdoms of England at the time were not prepared for this massive force of Vikings. One by one, kingdoms like East Anglia, Northumbria, and Mercia fell to the Vikings. My friends, the kings of England at that time were having sleepless nights, not knowing how to overcome this fear of the Vikings. Among the leaders of the great Viking army were the sons of Ragnar Lodbrok. These names are always mentioned in Viking legends: Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and Halfdan Ragnarsson. Don't think of these names as myths. They were leaders who actually existed and brought the land of Britain under the rule of the Vikings. Ivar the Boneless was especially known for his cruelty. He was a leader who would not kneel on the battlefield and showed no mercy. His strategic acumen and ruthless rule led the Vikings from victory to victory. But for every great army, there is a leader who can stand against it. And here comes Alfred the Great. The man who presided over England's resistance and was one of the most important figures in preventing the Vikings from completely conquering Britain, ruler of the Kingdom of Wessex. Alfred is known as the only king to stand up to the Vikings. His story is an epic part of England's resistance to Viking attacks. Alfred was a genius not only on the battlefield but also in strategic planning. He understood that fighting the Vikings was not only possible with weapons. He focused on educating his people, strengthening fortifications, building castles to protect villages. This struggle between the Vikings and Alfred was a battle of wits and strength. Although the Vikings inflicted great damage on Alfred's forces with their sudden raids, Alfred developed strategic moves against them every time. Especially in 878, at the Battle of Edington, Alfred defeated the Vikings and wrote his name in gold letters in history. This victory meant not only winning a war but also shaping the future of England. After this victory, Alfred made a treaty with the Vikings and the Danelaw region was established. This area would be under the control of the Vikings, but the rest of England would remain under Alfred's rule. The complex relationship between England and the Vikings was characterized by war and struggle, but also by cultural interactions. The Vikings left their mark on these lands not only with sword and axe, but also with their cultural influence. While the Viking settlers brought their laws and culture to England in the Danelaw region, the local people adapted to this culture over time. In fact, the language of the Vikings made a great contribution to the English language. Even today, many words in the English language are from the language of the Vikings. My young friends, England and the Frankish Empire were not only the destinations of the Vikings, but also the lands where they left their cultural imprint. The Vikings brought not only war to these lands, they brought trade routes, maritime knowledge, even art and culture. But as important as these interactions were, it is their passion for warfare and how it transformed Europe that the Vikings are most remembered for. The period when the great Viking army swept across Britain, combined with the resistance of Alfred the Great, left its mark on the stage of history. Every moment of this struggle is an epic of the Vikings' ruthless power and Britain's resistance. And don't forget that this is a story that laid the foundations not only of that period but also of today's Europe. The Vikings left not only destruction but also lasting traces in the places they came from. My friends, now I will take you to the green lands of Ireland and the far reaches of Scotland to tell you of a time when the Vikings did not come only for war and plunder. Yes, this time the Vikings came to leave a lasting mark. Just as the Vikings had attacked England, imagine them heading for the lands of Ireland and Scotland. But they didn't just loot here, they started to put down roots and build cities. And one of those cities was Dublin, which would write its name in golden letters in history. The Viking Age, which started with the Lindisfarne raid in 793, quickly turned into a conquest movement that spread all over Europe. The Vikings who headed to these new lands were not only after booty. They were after establishing permanent settlements in these lands and taking trade into their hands. In this process, the Vikings' dominance on the seas made them shine when they came to the east coast of Ireland. The day they laid the foundations of Dublin, they witnessed the birth of a civilization. Dublin was initially a Viking settlement, but over time it grew and developed. The city became a center of trade. The seafaring skills of the Vikings created a vast trading network stretching from Norway to Ireland, from Central Europe to North Africa. The Vikings not only made the city a center of trade, but also used it as a fortress where they consolidated their power. On every street in Dublin, there are reminders that the Vikings were brave sailors. Oh, think about it. In the narrow streets you can hear the excited voices of Viking merchants, haggling and bargaining as they sold the valuables they brought from all over the seas. Dublin was not just a city, it was an icon. It was a fortress, a port, and a center of both military and commercial power of the Vikings. Everything had changed in this city. The Vikings mingled with the locals and changed trade and culture. Dublin soon became the largest and most important city in Ireland, showing how successful the Vikings could be as settlers too. They were not only warriors, they were also the founders of a great trading empire. But was it only Dublin that was influenced by the Vikings? No, my friends. They marched all the way to the farthest reaches of the north. Scotland and Orkney Islands were also lands that bore the mark of the Vikings. These lands were quickly conquered thanks to the seafaring skills of the Vikings. When they came to the west coast of Scotland and the Orkney Islands, the Vikings began to take root there too. This time the Vikings didn't just come to plunder and destroy, they also established settlements here and changed the fate of these lands. The Orkney Islands became one of the Vikings' strategic bases. These islands allowed them to gain power in the North Sea and advance deeper into Scotland. For a while there were conflicts between the Vikings and the locals, but soon the Vikings managed to establish a permanent settlement here. The inhabitants of the islands learned to live with the Vikings and even mixed with them over time, forming a common culture. Scotland was a different challenge for the Vikings. The Scottish tribes put up fierce resistance against the Vikings' raids, but the Vikings were indomitable warriors. Think about it. In the most rugged lands of Scotland, the Vikings fought bravely, facing the Scottish tribes. Even these lands, hidden behind rivers, mountains, and seas, were not spared from the Vikings' greed for conquest. The islands and coasts west of Scotland came under the rule of the Vikings. Viking settlements were established in these lands, and these settlements left a deep mark on Scotland's culture over time. The Vikings did not only exist in Scotland and Orkney through war. They also spread their traditions and customs in the settlements they established in these lands. In the Orkney Islands, Viking culture merged with local culture to create a new blend. The people of these islands were shaped by the influence of the Vikings. Even today, traces of the Viking past can be seen in the Orkney Islands. My friends, as you walk through these lands, you can feel the footsteps of the Vikings. Their warrior spirit and desire for exploration is etched into this land. That's it. The Vikings were not only warriors. They were also city builders, merchants, and settlers. The charming streets of Dublin, the rugged coast of Scotland, and the mystical air of the Orkney Islands show how powerful and influential the Vikings were. The Vikings sailed the seas and explored new worlds, demonstrating not only their fighting prowess, but also their mastery of trade and cultural interaction. From Dublin to the Orkney Islands, this Viking story tells how they sailed the seas not only for war, but also to build new worlds. The Vikings were both a people of conquerors and builders. My friends, these stories show how they built a civilization and how the traces of that civilization persist even today. My dear friends, the story of the Vikings didn't just stay in the West, along the shores of England and Ireland. They were brave sailors and determined warriors who set their sights eastward as well. Can you imagine? They traveled all the way to the vast Russian steppes, moving along rivers, and there they established a new world. It was here that the foundations of the Rus-Varangian principalities were laid, leaving a mark on history. With the winds of the ocean at their backs, the Vikings embarked on a new adventure through the cool waters of the rivers. Now close your eyes and picture this Viking longships gliding down the Volga and Dnieper rivers, making their way into Russian territory. These lands were like a mystery back then. Smoke rose from distant villages, and local tribes roamed the wide plains. The Vikings showcased their warrior spirit here too, but this time not just as raiders, they acted as settlers and rulers. Known as the Varangians, these northern warriors quickly integrated with the local people, paving the way for the rise of powerful principalities like Kiev and Novgorod. Kiev, located in present-day Ukraine, this city founded by the Vikings eventually became the heart of a civilization. The Varangian Vikings formed strong alliances with the Slavic tribes there, establishing a powerful principality. These principalities didn't just govern the local people, they controlled trade routes and accessed the wealth of the East. They took charge of a vast trade network stretching from northern Europe to Byzantium. Gold, furs, precious stones. This new world was filled with opportunities for discovery and profit for the Vikings. But my friends, the Viking story this time wasn't just about trade and conquest. They found themselves facing a great empire, the Byzantine Empire. Can you imagine how far they ventured? The Vikings even reached the Black Sea, becoming both allies and enemies of Byzantium. Picture this when they arrived at the magnificent capital of Byzantium, Constantinople, today's Istanbul. Imagine their eyes widening in awe beneath those grand walls. The relationship between the Byzantine Empire and the Vikings flourished not just on the battlefield but also along trade routes. The Vikings began exchanging valuable goods with the Byzantines. The Byzantines recognized the power of these brave warriors and employed them not only as traders but also as mercenaries. This is how the famous Varangian Guard came to be. The elite bodyguards of the emperors were made up of Vikings. Just think about it, the fierce warriors from the north were protecting the emperor in the heart of Byzantium. In those palaces, Vikings donned armor adorned with gold while navigating the intricate politics of Byzantium. However, these relations were not always peaceful. As the Vikings gazed upon Byzantium's wealth, their eyes sparkled with desire. Remember those days when they launched attacks on Constantinople? They sailed down from the Black Sea to reach the massive walls of that great city. Imagine their longships gliding through the narrow waters. And the moment the people of Byzantium heard about the arrival of these terrifying warriors, the Byzantines, armed with strong walls and fiery weapons, pushed the Vikings back. Yet the Vikings' determination allowed them to become a feared and respected force in the eyes of the Byzantines. My friends, the Vikings' eastern adventure was very different from their raids in the west. They left their mark not just as warriors, but as rulers and traders. Cities like Kiev and Novgorod showcased their mastery in diplomacy and trade. Their relationship with Byzantium was proof of how brave they were in battle and how cunning they were in commerce. The Vikings built a new world in the east, creating a strong ruling class there. Their interactions with Byzantium transformed them into more than just warriors, they became a part of the diplomatic world as well. The Varangian Vikings served as a bridge that shaped the history of both the East and the West. Even today, the traces of the principalities they established can be felt deep within Russia's history. My friends, the Vikings once again changed the course of history. Through the principalities they established in Russia and their relations with Byzantium, they became masters not just of the seas, but of civilizations as well. My dear friends, the incredible adventures of the Vikings were not limited to England, Russia, or Byzantium. Today I will tell you how the Vikings once again built a civilization on the northern coast of France, this time starring the great Viking leader Rollo. This giant-sized, powerful warrior set foot on the land of France in such a way that he not only wreaked destruction, but also laid the foundations of a permanent home. Close your eyes and think a beach where the wind howls and beats the waves, that moment when the tall Viking ships come ashore. Early 9th century. On the northern coast of France, the land that would give Normandy its name is being shaken by these new raids of the Vikings. At its head is the brave and determined Rollo. Rollo was a leader whose massive body and relentless fighting inspired fear and respect in those around him. He rose to power with his raids into France, striking deep fear into the hearts of the people of the region. But my dear friends, this story is not all about war, because Rollo was not only a warrior, but also a leader, a diplomat. His genius was not only in his sword, but in his strategy. King Charles III of France, tired of the constant attacks of the Vikings, realized the difficulty of resisting them. And at that moment, a unique agreement emerged in history. This agreement between Rollo and King Charles laid the foundation for a peace between the Vikings and the Franks that would last for years. But it was not just a peace treaty, it was also the birth of the Duchy of Normandy. With this treaty with the King of the Franks, Rollo was able to secure for himself and his men the land that would become known as Normandy. But it came at a price, Rollo becoming a Christian and agreeing to become a vassal of the King of the Franks. Imagine this ferocious leader of the Vikings had to kneel and bow to the king. The stories tell that Rollo refused to kneel before the king and one of his men bowed instead, but that didn't stop the deal from going through. Ah, my friends, this is where the Vikings turned over a new leaf. Normandy has become a homeland, a permanent territory for the Vikings. They were not only marauders, but they settled, farmed, and traded in this land. Christianity slowly began to spread in these lands. But the warrior spirit in them never died out. Rollo's descendants soon became strong enough to compete with the other duchies in France. And so this region, which became known as Normandy, became one of the Vikings' greatest powers in Western Europe. The language, culture, and warrior spirit of the Vikings blended with Frankish culture. It was now a Viking homeland, but it was also a Frankish duchy. With the fusion of these two cultures, Normandy laid the foundations of an empire. But the story does not end here, my dear friends. Rollo's descendants would go even further. These lands would pave the way for the birth of William the Conqueror, who would change the course of history. Here is where the fate of the Vikings takes another turn, because Rollo's grandson William would leave the Norman lands to conquer England and take the throne of England in 1066 at the Battle of Hastings. Rollo's deal changed the fate not only of Normandy but of the whole of Europe. The Viking duchy he founded established a permanent foothold in Western Europe, a legacy that lasted for centuries. Even today, the region in the north of France known as Normandy remains a symbol of the Vikings' enduring legacy. Rollo took his place in history not only as a Viking warrior, but also as a civilization builder. Here, my friends, the Vikings showed how effective they were not only on the battlefield but also at the diplomatic table. Rollo's intelligence and foresight transformed the Vikings from mere raiders into a permanent power in Western Europe. Today we can still see these lasting traces of the Vikings in the lands of Normandy. Ah, the Vikings. Fearless conquerors of the seas, founders of civilizations and leaders who shaped the turning points of history. Ah, Eric the Red. That fearless and rebellious spirit was determined to conquer lands that didn't even have a name on the world map. Just think about it, a man banished from Norway, leaving his homeland in search of broader seas and tougher adventures. Eric couldn't find peace in the Scandinavian lands. His life was filled with exile after exile, first from Norway, then from Iceland. But none of this could extinguish his spirit. In fact, it only fueled the fire within him. and that fire led him to a piece of land covered in uncharted ice, Greenland. Greenland. When you hear the name, you might picture a lush green oasis. But the landscape that stretched out before Erik was just a white silence, a land untouched by man, where cold winds danced. However, when Erik looked at Greenland, he saw something completely different: hope. To him, this land was a fresh start for the Scandinavians. Here, he established a settlement with his son Leif. Sure, this icy land wasn't green, but Erik named it Greenland because he wanted to trick people into coming here. Clever, right? And it worked. Greenland became a new home for the Vikings. But this new settlement was just the beginning. Bigger adventures awaited Erik and his descendants. Erik's son, Leif Erikson, was the brightest star of that lineage. He inherited his father's adventurous spirit, but his eyes were set further west. Rumor had it that there was land beyond the seas, somewhere in the west. The Vikings called it Vinland, so Leif set sail to explore these new territories. Just imagine, until that time, no one had crossed those seas and returned. But Leif, as if he heard the call of the oceans, unfurled his sails without hesitation. And finally, he set foot on the shores of America. Yes, we call it America today, but back then it was just unknown land. When Leif and his men discovered this territory, they found a place filled with trees and vineyards. That's why they named it Vinland. This new discovery by the Vikings is a quietly significant victory, tucked away in the annals of history. This adventure is just one of the many sagas that tell of the Vikings' courage and spirit of exploration. Erik settling Greenland and Leif's journey westward meant more than just finding new lands for the Vikings. For them, it was about pushing their boundaries and conquering the unknown. With their eyes fixed on the horizons, these brave people reached out to lands beyond the seas, leaving an indelible mark on history. While Erik built a civilization in that icy land, Leif carried the spirit of their ancestors into the Western world. And so goes the story of Erik and Leif. They didn't just explore, they also opened a new chapter in human history. The story of the Vikings. Imagine this strong people, growing up amidst the cold winds of the north, deeply devoted to their beliefs and gods. Thor's hammer, Odin's wisdom, Freya's love. All of these shaped their world. However, over time, these fierce warriors didn't just swing swords in distant lands, they also encountered different cultures. And that was when a significant change began for the northern Vikings. Their old devotion to their ancient gods and beliefs gradually gave way to Christianity. But it wasn't an easy transition. As the Vikings launched expeditions to the west, they started to come into contact with Christian societies like the Franks and Anglo-Saxons. At first, accepting this new faith seemed like a sign of weakness to them. But as time went on, Christianity became more than just a belief, it became a source of power for kings. Leaders like King Olaf I of Norway embraced Christianity and tried to lead their people in that direction. However, Olaf's methods weren't exactly peaceful. Imagine one of these fearless kings burning pagan temples, destroying statues of old gods, and using force to make his people accept the new god. Olaf's real aim was to unify the Vikings into a stronger society, because Christianity was going to take them not only through a religious change but also towards new norms of civilization. During this time, Viking raids began to decrease. They were no longer just known as raiders, they were becoming a society that established its own kingdoms and strengthened them. Scandinavian kingdoms like Denmark, Norway, and Sweden started to centralize. Instead of expanding their lands, kings preferred to consolidate their existing power. The Vikings were no longer just warriors, they were also traders, farmers, and settled people. They began establishing more settlements in Western Europe and engaging in overseas trade. Over time, the Vikings' old raider image was replaced by that of a more civilized people. However, this process also brought about a significant change in the Vikings' deep-rooted identity. But the real moment marking the end of the Viking Age would come in 1066. That fateful day, the Battle of Stamford Bridge. When King Harald Hardrada of Norway set out to launch the last great Viking invasion into England, he probably had no idea he was bringing an era to a close. Hardrada aimed to take advantage of the internal turmoil in England and marched his forces to the bridge. When they faced the English on that great bridge, one of the bloodiest conflicts in history unfolded. Harald believed he would win this battle. The Viking spirit coursed through his veins, standing on the battlefield with the courage of his ancestors. However, King Harold Godwinson of England mounted a strong resistance. In the end, Norwegian King Harald Hardrada fell there at Stamford Bridge. This battle marked not only Harold's death but also the end of the Viking Age. Up until that day, the Vikings had instilled fear throughout Europe. But with this defeat at Stamford Bridge, the old Viking courage began to fade. The Scandinavian kingdoms also started to adopt a more inward-focused policy. Trade flourished, cultures mixed, and the Vikings shed their old warrior identity to become a more harmonious society with the rest of Europe. And so it goes. That legendary Viking Age came to an end with the acceptance of Christianity, the decline of raids, and the bloodshed at Stamford Bridge. But the legacy left by the Vikings still echoes across the seas of centuries past. The world of the Vikings. A society shaped by the cold lands and harsh winds sweeping across the shores. But those lands were not just home to warriors, they were also the cradle of a complex social order. The Viking society wasn't simple. Each individual knew their place and lived within this hierarchy. A system where kings ruled, jarls managed the lands, free men shared life in the snow, and slaves submitted to their fates. Let's dive into this structure in all its depth, almost like telling a tale. At the top of the Viking hierarchy were the kings. But these kings weren't always rulers of massive empires. They were more like leaders of tribes and small kingdoms. In the Viking world, power was measured by land and wealth. Kings had to constantly engage in conquests to win the loyalty of their warriors. Their power was sustained not only through direct inheritance but also through the spoils of war and their demonstrated leadership. The king's closest advisors were the jarls. Jarls were the right-hand men of the kings, managing vast lands and armies. They were known for their wealth, warrior spirit, and loyalty to their people. A jarl was not just a landowner but also the king's most trusted advisor. However, not everything in Viking society belonged to the upper class. The real power holders were the carler, or free men. These people were the backbone of Viking society. Farmers, craftsmen, and traders. They managed their own affairs and supported their kings in battles when needed. For the Vikings, farming, trade, and war were inseparable parts of a life cycle. Every free Viking had the right to bear arms. For them, war was not just a necessity, but also something that defined their honor and status. Going to war for a Viking meant securing a place in Valhalla. That's why, for the carler, fighting was more about honor than duty. But as in any society, at the bottom of the hierarchy were the slaves. Viking slaves came from captured enemy warriors, those taken as spoils, or individuals unable to pay their debts. They were people stripped of freedom, forced to serve their masters. Vikings also used their slaves for trade. Slave trading was particularly significant in commerce with Arab traders. However, even in Viking society, there were times when slaves could regain their freedom. They could become free individuals if their masters granted them freedom, or if they managed to escape. Yet, just as important as the hierarchy was the deep belief system of this harsh society. The Vikings saw the world through a lens filled with mythology and gods. Pagan beliefs permeated every moment of their lives. Everything depended on the gods. They were the ones who brought victory, made the land fertile, and protected their souls at the moment of death. At the top of the Scandinavian pantheon stood Odin. wise and powerful. Odin was the god of war, wisdom, and poetry. He had sacrificed one eye, willing to give up everything to gain knowledge. He was also the one who welcomed the souls of warriors into Valhalla, the Hall of the Immortals. Every death brought them one step closer to Odin's glory. Following Odin, the most beloved god was undoubtedly Thor. Thor was the god of thunder and lightning, the protector of the Vikings, and one of their greatest warriors. With his massive hammer, Mjolnir, he struck down his enemies like lightning and drove away evil. Thor was not only a warrior but also a protector of the people. His name symbolized victory for warriors. And then there was Freya, the goddess of love, war, and death. Freya was a figure that united two worlds. Besides being a symbol of love and beauty, she also collected the souls of those who fell in battle. On the battlefield, there were those chosen by Odin and those chosen by Freya who would find peace in her hall. Freya represented the strong role of women as well. This goddess, concerned with both the beauty of life and war, was an inspiration for Viking women. And of course there was Valhalla. Ah, that legendary hall. Valhalla was where those who died honorably on the battlefield continued to fight forever. Odin's grand hall was filled with massive feasts and endless games of war. Every Viking warrior dreamed of being accepted into Valhalla one day, because being in Valhalla promised a life where war never ceased and victory and honor lasted eternally. Every hero who fell in battle was invited to join Odin as an eternal warrior in Valhalla. The Viking society presented a unity through its hierarchy, beliefs, and gods. This warrior people dedicated their lives to the gods, saw the world through a mythological lens, and lived every moment with honor. Those fierce Vikings weren't just raiders, they were people guided by the power of their gods, possessing a profound spiritual world. Ah, the Vikings. The tough kids of the north, masters of the seas and feared warriors. But they didn't just leave a mark on Europe with their weapons, their culture made a deep impact too. For years, the Vikings launched raids across Europe, plundering lands and destroying cities. Yet we shouldn't forget that these raids didn't just bring destruction. They left lasting effects as well. The Vikings shaped Europe not only with their swords but also through their way of life, language, and culture. One of the Vikings' biggest contributions to Europe was the transformation of settlements. These brave northern sailors didn't just raid, they settled down, farmed, and established towns. For instance, they ruled over a region in England known as Danelaw for a long time. The Vikings didn't just conquer this land, they settled in and developed agriculture and trade. Traces of the Norse language can still be seen in modern English. In fact, many everyday words in English have Viking origins. Their legal systems also influenced Anglo-Saxon law, leaving marks that can still be traced to our current understanding of law. And then there's France. With the Vikings settling in Normandy, a new culture emerged in these lands which still carries the name of the Vikings. The Normans, the descendants of the Vikings, changed the course of European history. In 1066, William the Conqueror etched his name in history by conquering England. This conquest didn't just change England, it altered the political and cultural landscape of all Europe. As the Normans strengthened ties between France and England, the Vikings' legacy continued to flow through this new noble class. But the Vikings' legacy wasn't limited to political or military achievements. Their craftsmanship, expertise in shipbuilding, daring seafaring, and skills in trade became foundational to developments across Europe. Viking longships managed to reach the farthest corners of Europe. These ships were not just war vessels, they were also vital for expanding trade routes and increasing cultural interactions. The Vikings traded from the Mediterranean to the Black Sea and even into the Islamic world, creating a wide sphere of influence. Their brave spirit inspired new discoveries. What about Viking art? Yes, their aesthetic sense was equally remarkable. Their skills in metalwork and wood carving influenced both their culture and European art. The intricately knotted Viking jewelry and detailed carvings on ships can still be seen in many forms of art across Europe today. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were also great craftsmen and artists. As time passed, the Vikings' influence on Europe carried over into the modern world. Today, they continue to be a strong source of inspiration in literature, cinema, and art. Just think about it, you can find traces of Vikings in every epic narrative. Viking legends, sagas, and tales have become an endless source of inspiration for modern writers and filmmakers. The brave warriors of Middle-earth in J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, or the rugged northerners created by George R.R.R. Martin in A Song of Ice and Fire are inspired by Viking culture. In cinema, the magnificent lives of the Vikings have frequently been brought to the big screen. The series Vikings, starting with the story of Ragnar Lothbrok, gathered a massive global audience. This show dramatically portrayed the Vikings' tough lives, family bonds, beliefs, and explorations, drawing viewers into their world. Viking warriors have become modern heroes, not just historical figures. In art, Viking symbols, mythological figures, and battle scenes still continue to inspire many artists today. Viking helmets, shield motifs, and even runic inscriptions have become common elements in today's design world. These symbols carry the strong and brave spirit of the Vikings into modern art. In conclusion, the Vikings are not just a part of history, their legacy still lives on today. Their influence is evident in every corner of Europe, from political structures to cultural identity, art, and language. And in the modern world, the spirit, myths, and stories of the Vikings continue to inspire and ignite imaginations. Ah, friends. As you can see, the story of the Vikings is not just about bloody battles and ruthless raids. They were a society shaped not only by swords but also by culture, beliefs, exploration, and art. The Vikings left their mark all across Europe, creating a legacy etched into history books and transformed into myths and legends. Their brave spirit that sailed the seas continues to echo in the depths of our modern world, even today. Perhaps there's a little Viking in each of us. A passion for adventure, the courage to step into the unknown, or the determination to fight for the values we believe in. The Vikings didn't just conquer lands, they changed the course of history, influenced civilizations, and built bridges to today's world with their languages and cultures. As we share their stories today, those tales don't just remain dusty pages of history, they live on. Their traces are still present in our modern world in movies, books, art, and even in our everyday lives. Odin's wisdom, Thor's strength, Freya's love. All of these still hold a place in our memories. The story of the Vikings is the story of humanity itself. And this story comes alive whenever a wave crashes against the shore, whenever a storm stirs the northern winds, and whenever an adventurer sets sail. Because the Vikings are not just heroes of the past, but of all time. Remember, those who dare in this world, those who explore and push boundaries, are always remembered. Who knows, maybe one day you'll write your own saga like the Vikings. Now the story I've told by the fire comes to an end, but the spirit of the Vikings is still with us. When you look at the stars, maybe somewhere out there across the seas a Viking ship is sending you greetings. I see the sparkle in your eyes. I can feel the flame of your warrior spirit igniting. May your journey be bright, my friends. May the wind be at your back, guiding you to new adventures.